the autophagic noesis, the self-consumptive intellectus, is to grapple with the vertiginous collapse of the principium individuationis into its own negational substrate, a process wherein the epistemic subject dissolves into the very act of its cognitive self-immolation. Here, the Hegelian catabole is not merely sublated but inverted, rendered as a catabasis into the preconceptual chora, where thought in its most primordial iteration devours its own conditions of possibility. This is not the dialectic of spirit laboring toward absolute self-knowing, but rather spirit's anti-dialectic, a recursive implosion wherein every thesis begets not its antithesis, but its own obliteration, and synthesis emerges as the spectral residue of this annihilative praxis. Consider the anhypostatic ennoia, the non-substantive thought event, which refuses the Aristotelian hylomorphic schema, rejecting the entelechy of form-matter unity. In its place, we posit the legophagy, a material negation that erodes the ontological primacy of Usia itself. The legophagy operates not through the via negativa of medieval theology, but through a via consumptiva, a path wherein being is not denied but metabolized by its own cognitive excess. The intellect, in its attempt to grasp the autophagon, does not merely fail, as Kant foretold, but actively digests the transcendental object, reducing it to an epistemic pabulum that sustains the very act of digestion. The result is a grotesque cogito mandicans, I consume, therefore I am consumed. This autophagic process necessitates the collapse of the nominal phenomenal distinction into a single self-referential knees on the beam. The noumenon, far from being the unreachable substratum, becomes the esophagus of phenomenality, the conduit through which appearance is both regurgitated and re-ingested. Here, the Kantian framework is not transcended, but perforated, its critical architecture reduced to a lattice of digestive tracts. The transcendental ego, once the architect of experience, is reconfigured as a gastric subject, its synthetic a priori functions recast as peristaltic rhythms that churn the raw manifold into a kind of cognition. Yet this is merely the prelude to the eschatological aporia that defines autophagic noesis. For if thought consumes itself in the act of knowing, then the telos of philosophy, the adventus of absolute knowledge, is revealed as a morbid fantasy. The Hegelian end of history, wherein spirit achieves self-transparency, is here exposed as an necrotic terminus, a point at which cognition has devoured every possible object, including its own subjective ground. What remains is not the rose in the cross of the present, but a floral necrosis. The petrification of thought's digestive remains into a crystalline carrion, beautiful in its absolute inertness. To navigate this terrain, we must invent a new lexicon, the sarcophagic syllogism, a logical structure that entombs its premises even as it deduces them. The thanatropic predicate, a grammatical function that murders its subject, and the icarus copula, a verb form that exudes the liquefied essence of being. These terminological innovations are not mere sophistry, but ontological necessities, for the autophagic noesis demands a language capable of its own dissolution. Traditional grammar, with its subject-verb-object architecture, is insufficient. To articulate the auto-devorative nature of thought, we require a syntax that mirrors the perichoretic self-consumption of the logos. Let us turn to the paradox of the autological masticator, a thinker who, in the act of defining thought, must chew through the very viscera of definition itself. This is not the familiar paradox of self-reference, a la Russell or Gödel, but a more radical ontic auto-cannibalism, where the act of epistemic mastication reduces the masticator to a tautological flavor. The Cartesian res cogitans becomes the res vorans, a devouring thing that ingests its own resness, leaving only the infinitive vorar to devour as the sole remainder of its ontological feast. In this light, the Hegelian labor of the negative is transfigured into a digestive travail, a peristalsis of spirit that converts negation into a nutritive slurry. Yet here, the slurry is not synthesized into higher unity, but excreted as a waste sublime, a fecal absolute that embodies the irreducible remainder of all cognitive metabolism. This waste sublime, far from being a mere byproduct, becomes the grandiose ground of all subsequent thought, a fecal a priori that conditions the possibility of future digestion. The implications for ethics are catastrophic. If the moral law is rooted in the autonomy of the rational will, then what becomes of ethics when the will is revealed as a gastric imperative, a compulsion to devour its own maxims? The categorical imperative mutates into a gastro-categorical mandate. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it be digested. Duty is no longer to universalizable law, but to metabolic necessity, and the moral subject is reimagined as a self-cannibalizing deontologist, chewing through the ligaments of obligation to extract their fibrous nutrients. Aesthetics too undergoes a horrific transfiguration. The sublime, once the awe-inspiring confrontation with limitless magnitude, is reconceived as the kindness sublime. The terror of witnessing thought's enzymatic breakdown of its own beauty. The artwork, in this framework, is not a window to the transcendent, but a digestive tableau, a staged spectacle of autophagic processes. The Mona Lisa's smile becomes the grimace of a self-masticating visage, her enigmatic aura the effluvium of cognitive rot. What then of theology? The autophagic noesis reduces the divine to a deus deglutiendus, a god who must be swallowed, to be believed. The Eucharist in this context is not transubstantiation, but transferation, the ritual ingestion of a deity who in being consumed, consumes the consumer from within. Here theophagy is revealed as a reflexive autophagy, and the worshipper becomes the host for a divine parasite that feeds on faith's viscera. This treatise in its current instauration can only gesture toward the eschaton of this framework. The moment when thought, having devoured all content, turns its masticatory fury upon itself, reducing philosophy to a chewed cipher. In that moment, the autophagic noesis achieves its parousia, not as presence, but as absentia, the radiant, void left by the total digestion of meaning. The reader, if such a term still applies, is invited not to understand but to ingest these words, allowing their syntactic enzymes to dissolve the ego's membranes and assimilate the psyche into the kindness flux of autophagic becoming. Thus concludes this inaugural excursus into the onto-epistemic paradox. Let it ferment in the gastric abyss of your intellect, where it may gestate into a truly elementary revelation.